Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. This would be our 20th video to date. Our last video was said to be one of the most controversial issues of the century because of how it ended when Magnus Carlsen could never have won an otherwise lost game. If you wish to go through that game, we can provide a link, which should appear any time now on the top right of your screen. What we wish to cover today is yet another controversial matter. It's a very long story, but these are the two grandmasters we shall be looking at. Magnus Carlsen is the only one to have opened up. He first lost to Hans Niemann, he then resigned on move 1 when the two met again, and then walked out of the tournament to make a point. If Magnus Carlsen would not have said anything, no one would ever have known, and no one would have said anything to raise any suspicion of foul play. Whoever knew who Hans Niemann was before he played against Carlsen, and why is everyone just talking about him 24/7? It all started when Magnus Carlsen said in a tweet that he would say nothing, because if he did, he would have been in trouble. That tweet reached the entire chess community, and right now, any rumors that surround this issue have spread like a virus across the field. What did Carlsen mean when he said what he said? It all became evident 2 weeks after. He produced a statement accusing the 19-year-old Hans Niemann of cheating in their first encounter in an otherwise flawless performance. We shall cover this game, but before we do, a word on the procedures and how the Sinkfield Cup operated this year. Each and every player who participated in this event was scanned from top to bottom to ensure they would not have a means to gain any unfair advantage through cheating. Since Hans Niemann was taking part in this event, he too went through the scrutiny of scanners repeatedly. These are some of the pictures that circulated to ensure cheating was not existent, but would it be at all possible to still find a way to cheat when you get passed through the scanners? As we said earlier, if Carlsen would have said nothing, no one out there would have raised any suspicion about the young Hans Niemann. Many sources investigated the Magnus-Hans game, but none of them could produce any evidence whatsoever that Hans cheated. Chess.com produced recently a 72-page report on Hans Niemann. Though they do suspect Hans to have cheated, no evidence was produced to back up their findings. What the report says is that Hans had likely received illegal assistance in more than 100 online games. If Chess.com claims this to be true, why had they not acted on this earlier? Hans's ELO in recent times has shot up at an exponential rate. In September 2020, his rating was 2,465, a year later this rating shot up to 2,609, and in September 2022, Hans's rating moved up to 2,688. One thing that we should mention is what Jacob Agard said about Hans Niemann. He said he met Hans in St. Louis back in 2019 when Hans was about 2,450. Hans was thinking of quitting the game, but in the end continued when his attitude changed. During one of their training sessions in endgame techniques, Hans was really liked. Going through exercises from recent games in the last 18 months, Hans knew them all, something Jacob liked. Jacob was additionally astonished by his memory and intuition. Both, according to Jacob, were off the charts when comparing Hans's training to that of Shankland, Gelfand and other 2,600-plus players. Having said all this, the big question still remains. Has Hans cheated, and if so, how did he do it? Chess.com had closed his online account when Hans confessed he cheated previously, but why was his account reopened, and why allow Hans Niemann another chance? This resulted again in closing down his second account, and for those who wish to learn more, all you need is to obtain that report and read it. It is not as long as 72 pages because the latter part of this report shows diagrams and representations. And before we come to the game to be covered, why do so many people believe Hans cheated? Carlsen never walked out of a tournament, and this was obviously a first. He only did this to prove a point. He was adamant Hans cheated, but with no one not knowing how this was done in case he cheated, there is nothing anyone can do. People, at least in the Western world, are innocent until proven guilty. Insofar as there is nothing concrete to prove Hans Niemann cheated, there is nothing you can do but just face up to the facts. If you check on Twitter, Elon Musk corroborated someone else's story and went on to say anal beads were used to allow Hans to cheat. His tweet was since deleted, but we still have this extract to show everyone. Elon, as you can see, uses Arthur Schopenhauer famous say. Philosopher Schopenhauer was born in Poland. To get one thing clear, Arthur himself missed out what you see in the parenthesis, and this is what Elon Musk added. The original Arthur code is what you see here. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Elon was more specific in what he wanted to say, and this is why he modified the quote. No one really knows other than Elon Musk if this was meant to be a joke. With this in mind, let's us go and examine closely the game that sparked everything, and the reason why Magnus Carlsen dropped out of an event for the first time ever. So what we are looking at is the game of round 3 between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann. To reach the point, Hans drew Aronian in round 1, and in round 2, he had beaten Mamedov. Carlsen had beaten Nepo in round 1, and in round 2 he drew against Aronian respectively. So this is what we have seen. Magnus with the white pieces opened up with 1d4, Hans opts for this knight move, and with c4, this is how Hans answers. Knight c3 led to the Nimzo. In the likely case of a queen move, Carlsen can also opt for a simple e3. He bypassed these options for this push on the king side. It is both an unusual and also a rare move too. Hans after the game claimed to have prepped this opening, but how likely was this the case when this move was hardly tried before? If we are not wrong, Carlsen tried this in only a single game, but there is way more to follow. The engine's top choice of move was to castle, and this is what Hans also plays. With Carlsen getting his bishop into the diagonal, Hans shoots off with this pawn. And with Carlsen now charging after the bishop, this bishop had a choice. You can either get him to back off or simply trade. With Hans trading, Hans gets rid of this pawn, Magnus here develops his knight, and with another top engine recommended move, Hans just goes for it. This was that move. Magnus seems to have everything under control. He first got his king to safety, these two pawns in the center went, and with Magnus taking with the queen, though trading the queens appears to be a good idea, Hans bypasses this move and chooses to chase after the queen. So what in fact happened here is that Hans has just allowed Magnus to gain an otherwise saved pawn, but why does he do this? With the pawn now gained, Hans advanced this pawn to the 5th, and what this move allowed is for Magnus to apply this pin. h6 looks to be the right time to force this bishop to act, and this is exactly how Hans moved on. Magnus is not for nothing the world's number 1. He could always act on this threat, but for better or worse, this is how he plays it. He is in a way testing Hans' limitations, but he was in for some real treat when he saw how Hans responded to this threat. Before we get to see Hans' reaction, how would this queen move fare? If you take and take, rook d2 for example, in the likely effect to double up the rooks, can lead to this subsequent attack on the queen. Queen b5 challenging now this pawn on b7 can lead to some deep complications. The question to ask is whether you would want to save this pawn or just let him go. Though rook b8 using either rook looks fine, what is you tried this rook move to c8 using the kingside rook? Should you get greedy and go on to get rid of this pawn, be warned, you are in for a real treat. If you chase after the queen in this way, removing yet another pawn may not look that bad after all, and this is despite the likely fork on the rooks using the knight. Rook d1, takes and takes with the rook, is now going to drop yet another pawn on the 3rd, and this game is practically over. You also need to be very careful not to get checkmated on the 1st. Okay, this is not likely because the bishop would be in place to stop everything, but once again, this is one position you cannot afford to go through. You can avoid a first rank check by advancing this pawn to the 4th, but if you play this one out carefully, there can only be one winner. If we return to the actual game, Magnus being confronted with this bishop attack on his own queen, was in a way forced to act. He basically very few and accurate answers. He first removed the queen, Hans does the same thing using the bishop, and with Magnus removing this rook, Hans in turn goes on to capture him. Once the most powerful pieces on the board departed, The game now appears to simplify. There is a threat on the bishop on g5, but it is Carlsen's decision on how he chooses to proceed. He traded his bishop to the knight, and now with the bishop's immediate capture, Magnus creates an important opening. But how effective is this gap on the kingside, and how can anyone utilize it? With this pawn on e2 now in danger, the options are as follows. 1. You can advance him. 2. You can move the king to protect him, and 3. You can move the rook in place to hold on to him. Carlsen opted for option number 2. Hans in turn brings his own rook into the action, and though this game looks dead, it is nothing of the sort. King e1 led to this knight jump. This is one hell of a move, and one that Magnus was finding incredibly hard to deal with. He was aware of Hans cheating in the past, but was his mind thinking the same was happening in this game? Irrespective of the answer, Magnus still carried on. He challenged the rook in this way and wanted the rooks to come off. Should Hans trade here, and if not, what else is there to go for? According to Stockfish, the trade would not be beneficial. The engine suggests rook c8. What does Hans do here? He went for the very same move the engine suggested. The position after 19 moves looks more or less equal, and probably the game could end with each player sharing the point. This is provided both play all the right moves. Though Carlsen has all the experience in the world, something was telling him, this bishop on c4 was nothing but trouble. Even if you find a way to attack him, the knight on the rim would have his back, would he not? Using this logic, Magnus redirected the knight to chase after the bishop, and was more than willing to trade his knight to the bishop. The decision here rested with Hans Niemann. If he wanted, the knight would be traded to the bishop, and that would be it. However, because Hans did not want the bishop swapped to a knight, he pulled him back to safety, and by placing him here on e6, the idea is that this bishop might come in handy later on. And this is the reason why the knight on a5 is parked here. He is in time to protect the pawn on b7, but even if he was not protected, would bishop a6 be any better? Maybe, maybe not. Magnus spent just about 1 minute and 27 seconds on his follow-up response. He calculated a very interesting line, but was never sure if it could work. What he did was to push along with this pawn, and in fact he is actually offering a full pawn. The question is whether Hans should take, and if so, how. Nearly 9.5 minutes later, Hans takes the decision to remove this pawn. Magnus in turn hands over the knight for the bishop, and with Hans capturing using the rook, any ideas how Carlsen proceeds? He came in with this check. King g7 led to the near instant attack on the rook, but this was no real biggie for Hans. He can either deliver a check of simply back off. Back off it was in the end. Rook a8 led again to this push to the 6th, and now with Magnus going after this pawn, this is how Hans answers. By the way, this is also the engine's recommended move. It's an incredibly strong initiative, but can you spot why? Rook e8, attacking this pawn, led to him to advance further. Carlsen is at a loss here. Whatever he does, he is finding it very hard to shake Hans. He wanted to break Hans's pawn formation, and in the end this is how he tries to do it. Rook c5, attacking the bishop, led to this avenue of play. Though many major and powerful pieces are missing from the game, with a rook each and a bishop versus the knight, this is still a very complex game to say the least. With much happening across the board, Hans did not appear to worry about the state of his pawns on the kingside. He rather looked at the queenside and wanted to enable his knight to find a decent outpost on the chessboard. 4 minutes and 40 seconds down the line, this is what Hans does. In a way he is blocking the bishop's access to the game, and in a way he is forcing Carlsen to trade. But Carlsen had other ideas for his bishop. If you do not trade the bishop to the knight, this pawn on a3 will drop unless you find a way to cover him. Carlsen advanced this pawn, and this very move afforded Hans with the opportunity to take some advantage. He centralized the knight. This move is not just to attack the rook, but the knight now covers two important pawns. One on f7 and the other on b7. Carlsen could always attack the knight, but in the end settled for this move to e7. He, in a way, holds this knight hostage. Carlsen could expect the king to hunt after his rook, but in the end Hans does find a much stronger type of response. This knight on d6 is not just covering the pawn on b7 and f7 but in addition, this pawn on e4. So with the knight basically covering half the pawns on the chessboard, Hans removed this pawn from g4, Carlsen instantly redirects the rook to go after the knight and the next move Hans went for was extremely crucial. Would you like to guess that move or just sit back in your lazy chair and just wait to see it? Does this rook move work to cover for the knight? If you use the bishop to attack this rook, rook b6 will undoubtedly lead to this rook being bombarded, and even if you do go along and check the king, after king d2 and this brand new check, how strong would this king move to the third be? What we have here is a very messy picture. If you apply this check, you may never hear the end of it. King f4 would be strong enough to gain a substantial advantage and this would most definitely go Carlsen's way. To say the least, we saw nothing of the kind. What we saw instead was this push to the third. Who would ever imagine this extremely powerful Hans initiative? In a blitz, you would get instantly buried and particularly if you go on to get rid of the knight. All you need is this incoming check and it would be game over in a few moves. It's not a checkmate but Carlsen would be hopeless. And when the rook is just in time to stop everything, what he is in fact doing is to stop nothing. Once you take with a check, as soon as the rook drops, this is what you need. With the pawn coming off, this pawn will queen and that would be the end of this game. So if we return to the actual game, when Carlsen was confronted by this incredibly powerful blow, he had to find a way out. He does not remove the knight but first he took this pawn. In turn Hans Niemann jumps the knight into the center of the board, and with the mate threat now in one single move, Magnus was working out what best to do. Bishop b3 is one way to do it but it will not work. Why not? This check from the first will force the rook to return, but when both rooks depart, irrespective with how you capture, this game is finished. Not only the double pawns on e2 and e3 are a major problem but also these 1 2 3 4 5 black pawns are just unstoppable. So what happened right after Hans got his knight to find the center of the board? Magnus walked the king, and with this brand new check unfolding, Magnus was now forced to jump the king to the second. Rook c2 was the icing on the cake. With a check in the making from both sides, Carlsen was the first to initiate it. This was actually a close call. If you do go on to take with a check, after king g6 and bishop d5, this bishop attack on the knight is harmless. You can first take with a check, and if you go king f1, not rook takes e3, which is an excellent move but this move to d2 instead. Should this knight depart, so does the rook, and the game is over and out. For this very reason, right after this rook check was initiated, Carlsen does not chase after the rook but instead opts for this line of play. With this brand new check now emerging, Carlsen repeats, Hans repeats too, and with Magnus finally getting the king to repeat his last move, this is how Hans plays it. What we saw in the last 4 moves or so by Hans are typically what an engine would play. With the king moving into the 6th, Carlsen now attacks the knight but against all odds, Hans was the person who appeared to have had all the answers. He applied this pin, Magnus in turn checks the king, but with the king escaping to this outpost, this is how Magnus Carlsen plays it. Knight g5 was a very clever initiative but can you see the implications of this response? Magnus momentarily thought he would be able to gain the rook and does this by checking Hans' king in this way. If the bishop does come off, then you would have blown it only because Carlsen would gain the rook on the second. If this happens, you also know how this one would end. However, when this check appeared, this is how Hans does his thing and Carlsen was beginning to see the light of day. If only. As soon as this rook dropped, Hans applies this nasty fork and with the king making his way to the second, the knight just took the rook. Under the circumstances, bishops are seen to be much stronger on open boards, but in this case, we do have an exception. If you place all your pawns on squares the bishop has no access, then only the king would be able to get to them. You cannot say the same thing about the knight. This knight on d2 has the capability to jump into every single square on the board and no pawn is safe when knights are about. With Magnus pushing on, this is how Hans does his magic. King g3 led to this nasty check, and the continuation is not that hard to fish out. When this guy on g4 could have been removed, Magnus does not even go for him. He chased instead after the knight. With the knight getting rid of this pawn from the second, even the best human players are not immune to blunders. Carlsen went for this move to e4, but to say this was a blunder would be an understatement. With Hans grabbing hold of him, Carlsen redirects the bishop to this outpost, but with Hans immediately covering in this way, Magnus now redirects his bishop and wants to get rid of not one but two pawns, of course one at a time. Knight f3 led to the elimination of this pawn from b7, but as soon as Hans jumped the knight to the fifth, this were not looking for Carlsen. Okay, in the end Carlsen does manage to grab hold of yet another pawn, but as soon as he was confronted by this knight move, Carlsen knew this pawn on the rim could not be saved. Bishop b7 led to this pawn to bite the dust. Carlsen centralizes his bishop just to be able to keep him alive, but with this guy on the kingside making a break, bishop f7 led to this pawn to advance further. Bishop d5 once again, and this is where everything stops. Carlsen had enough and simply resigned to a player no one expected to beat him. We can go on to show the actual ending, but from this position, even a beginner might be quite capable of finding the answers. For those who want to see how this is done, after the bishop comes under attack, bishop a8, and now knight c4, and if king g2, this is what you are looking to do. King g1, and a simple push to the third will get you there in the end. Bishop d5, and now knight d2, and you are now looking at a mate. Bishop h1, g3, and the end is near. If you get the bishop to back off to this outpost, this incoming knight check will be decisive. King h1 does not work because when this check appears, with the knight parked on f3, what you see here is also a checkmate. Would king f1 be any stronger? Slightly, but the end result remains the same. When this check is initiated, king f2 will lead to this promotion, and what you are looking at is a mate in just two moves. King e2, and now this check, and right after the king is forced to the very first, this would be it and it would be game over. This was one way of many to demonstrate the what-ifs of certain moves. Carlsen was really shaken by this experience, but when he decided to go public with what he thought happened, the whole chess world was rocked. Given Hans Niemann went on to lose some of his follow-up games, had this 19-year-old genius player played an honest game or did he cheat? This is one question only Hans can answer. Hans said he cheated in the past but never in a game like this. Whether Hans won honestly, he would still be stigmatized for his previous behavior. Some people said once a cheater, always a cheater, and some others said Hans did commit an offense and had already paid for it. There are always two sides of a story if not more, but do you think Hans played an honest game and do you think he had beaten Carlsen without cheating? If he didn't, how did Hans bypass the scrutiny of scanners? If you look at the footage that exists, Hans was scanned from left to right and from top to bottom before his game against Carlsen. Others took this cheating a bit too far and suggested anal beads were used to communicate the right moves to him. Is this one reason why Hans said he wouldn't mind playing completely naked? Maybe, maybe not. Chess.com produced a very lengthy report on Hans only because it was in the public's interest. Their overall verdict is that Hans might have cheated in over 100 games, but if this were the case, why did they take no action at the time? The conclusion of this report is that Hans appears to have cheated, but there is no direct evidence to prove this. And this is the end of this video. Hans cannot be taken down on speculative reasons, and at least in this side of the world, you are innocent until proven otherwise. If you believe Hans played dishonestly, then you have to come up with the evidence to show. In the absence of any direct evidence linking Hans Niemann to any wrongdoing, he is deemed to be clean. This is one good reason why he is still allowed to compete in major tournaments. We sincerely hope you have enjoyed this video in particular, and our next edition will have to be looking at the Top Chess Engine Championship Superfinal of Season 23. The best 2 engines from the Premier League will be at it, in a 100-game match before the next winner is announced. Thank you for watching and God bless.